Now, for more on this conference in London aimed at combating sexual violence in conflict areas, we're joined here in studio by Professor Nyokabi Kamau, a gender and development consultant, as well as Dan Whitehead. He's in London. Dan, we'll begin with you. Looking at the summit, is expected to lead to specific, or rather, is it expected to lead to any specific policy initiatives to reduce sexual violence in conflict areas?
Well, the British Foreign Secretary William Hague will certainly be hoping that it will lead to solid improvements in this area. There are some clear aims which I mentioned in my report there. Among those include improving documentation and the investigation of allegations of sexual violence in conflict zones, as well as improving the support to the victims and the survivors of those who experience the crime, and also improving international coordination to remove sexual violence in conflict zones. Now, around 150 or so countries are attending this major summit here in London. The majority of those have already signed up to a declaration of commitment to end sexual violence in conflict zones. That really is a written document which says that they will ensure that they will work on these policies and these aims to ensure that sexual violence stops in conflict zones. But the British government's certainly putting a lot of weight behind this summit. It's pushing to ensure that commitments are made by not only African countries but countries in the Middle East and elsewhere around the world to ensure that this problem is eradicated.
Dan, we'll return to you in just a moment. Professor Kamau, if we look at what the summit intends on achieving, Britain has suggested that all soldiers as well as peacekeepers undergo some sort of training with regard to sexual violence in conflict areas, with regard to understanding as well as preventing that sort of thing from happening. Now, is that enough, and is that the way forward, considering that these are also the very people who have at times been accused of sexual violence themselves?
Well, thank you. It is important to train people because I think sometimes the peacekeepers may not quite be aware of what they are doing, and they come from the societies where women are used as a war, as kind of war. It's a weapon of war. Therefore, the training so that they do not use women that way, the same way properties are used, or the way people take away property or destroy property from a community, is the same way they destroy women and children. So therefore, training could help, is one of the things that can help. But in addition to that, of course, more needs to happen. In addition to training, is more of a socializing people. That it's not just training soldiers when they're already adults and grown-ups. Yeah? It's more of socialization process from when people are young people. They appreciate and respect women, and issues of power relations and patriarchy, where women are used as war weapon, then reduces, even as we introduce training. But I do think training is critical for peacekeepers.
Now let's return to Dan for just a moment. Dan, that conference is being hosted by the British government. So aside from initiatives they hope to implement abroad, what can the government there do at home? For instance, when dealing with asylum seekers who've escaped sexual violence, what can the British government actually do?
Well, that issue, it will very much be high on the agenda. I've been spending the day speaking to campaign groups and refugee groups who help people just like that, arriving from countries where there are conflicts and they have been affected by sexual violence. And one of the main things they say is that the help is not necessarily there from the British government. In fact, one refugee group telling me that they come across a number of case studies of women arriving from, for instance, the DRC, and saying that when they arrive in the UK, they are disbelieved and locked up in detention by the Home Office here in the UK. So there is certainly pressure on the British government to not only look at the situation and eradicating this problem in the countries where it is taking place abroad, but also reforming the process of how it helps those victims if and when they arrive on UK shores.
Now, Professor Kamau, Dan spoken there about the process in terms of addressing these issues around sexual violence against women. We also talk about sensitivity, or sensitizing people to exactly what should be done. Mm-hmm. What can governments here do to protect these women? Because we're hearing, according to statistics, that it's more dangerous to be a woman in a conflict zone than it is to be a soldier.
I agree. What governments can do and should do, first of all, is to talk and act peace. I think one of the main problems we have is where particularly elected leaders who also happen to be in government talk war-like language. So it's important that governments are seen to act and to preach peace. And in addition, because elected leaders have a lot of influence on how people then live and how they perpetuate this kind of violence, it's also important that elected leaders appear to involve women and appreciate the fact that women have gone through some of these challenges. Also, government peace initiatives must specifically target women and involve women. I think most of the times government peace initiatives leave out women. Even though governments may recognize that women and children have gone through these kind of atrocities, they kind of leave them out when they sit around what we call peacekeeping and peacemaking roundtables. So it's important to actually have women, not just women, but women who have actually gone through and suffered these kind of atrocities. So that's one of the things that governments can do. Also, community policing or community initiatives that promote peace. And these community initiatives should also have women, not just women who are elite women or women like myself and yourself, but women, all kinds of groups of women of age groups, young, middle age, social class, elite, non-elite, politicians, non-politicians. So in movement of all kinds of women who have experienced or may have experienced atrocities in different times of their lives.
And how else, just before we wrap up, Professor, how else can the women and even children affected by sexual violence in war zones, how else can they be helped to return to their normal lives? Because this is a situation that stays with them through their lives.
Well, one of the usual ways that is always done is the usual therapy and the usual counseling and all that. But one of the things that can be done in the long term, according to research that has been done, is first of all, inclusion. Inclusion of women in peace, long-term peace-building initiatives. Because peacekeeping is something that happens over only a short period of time. So their involvement in the planning and the implementation of this peace building. Don't just take them through counseling and then leave them. Because what happens during times of war, gender relations and issues of masculinities and feminities get understood very differently because of issues of militarization. So it is important there is long-term programs of involving and including women and young people who may have been affected by war, and especially sexual violence. So get to involve them when they are ready to get involved. But don't just assume that because you have taken them through counseling, then that's it.
Professor, well, thank you for your time this evening. Thanks for joining us here on Africa Live. We're speaking to Professor Nyokabi Kamau, a consultant on gender as well as development, as well as Dan Whitehead in London.